Hello, my B5 Nation. How's everyone doing today? Hopefully everyone's having a great day. If not, I hope it gets better from here. We are back with another MrBallen video. This one's titled Top 3 Places You Can't Go But People Went Anyways, Part 3. Alright, if you guys are as ready as I am for today's story, please go ahead, turn them lights down low, put on something comfy, cup with something special. Let's get concerned for these people and why they keep going in places they should not go.
Today I'm going to share with you 3 progressively more insane stories about people who went to forbidden locations around the world and what happened to them. Spoiler alert, it didn't end well. But before I get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right channel because that's all I do, and I upload 3, 4, even 5 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please invite the like button to go roller skating with you, but before you get to the rink, loosen all of their wheels. Also, please subscribe to this channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of my weekly uploads. Alright, let's get into today's stories.
Mute that. There we go. I get hit with copyright every great once in a while from I don't know why.
2011, Heike Dorsch and her boyfriend Stefan Rahman were living their best life sailing southwest from the Galapagos Islands. For the last 3 years, they had abandoned their lives in the city and had moved on to Stefan's catamaran and were just sailing the globe. On August 30th, 2011, after a particular stretch where they had been at sea for 17 days consecutively without seeing land anywhere, Heike was laying down on the catamaran catching some sun when she heard Stefan yell out, "Land!" And she looked up and she saw these mountainous islands kind of coming into view just over the horizon.
Land!
These were the 15 islands that make up the Marquesas Island range within French Polynesia. Heike remembers not being able to control her grin. It was like she couldn't stop smiling because it really looked like paradise, and she was so excited to land there. The Marquesas Island range were not big tourist attractions because of how mountainous and rocky they were, and the water was not that beautiful Kool-Aid blue that people expect out of French Polynesia. But for Heike and Stefan, this was perfect. They were not looking for mass market tourism, they were looking for authentic cultural contact. And it would turn out that the Marquesas Island range was perfect for this because the locals just weren't used to seeing tourists. And so before long, the locals were embracing Heike and Stefan and bringing them down to the beach for their cookouts and going spearfishing with them. And even one night they were invited into a local's home where they got to be a part of a big family dinner. After 6 weeks, Heike and Stefan had explored the majority of the Marquesas Island range, but there was still one of the 15 islands that they had not yet explored called Nuku Hiba. And so on the day before they planned to leave the island range, they decided to go check it out. When they dropped anchor in the bay that sat just outside of this island, there were no boats, there were no fishermen, there were no people, there was nothing. It was like a deserted island. And so they make their way on the beach and they see you probably don't need to be there. Inland. Being explorers, they couldn't help themselves but walk down the trail to see what's down there. After 15 minutes of walking down this jungle path, they come to a clearing, and in this clearing is this very strange looking village that's made up of all these shacks. They can't tell if people live there or have lived there recently because to them, it just looks totally abandoned. And as they're kind of looking around, they notice way down the path beyond these shacks is one man standing in the middle of the road. He's this really big guy with his shirt off, standing next to a horse, and he's just looking directly at them. He's not waving to them, he's not signaling to them, he's just watching them. And it kind of creeped them out at first, but they decided that the polite thing to do would be to go over and talk to him because this is probably his village and they were the trespassers. So they go over to this guy and they introduce themselves, and he says that his name is Arihano and that he lives in this village. Through broken French, they're able to have a semi-normal conversation which seemed like pleasantries. And at some point, Stefan, just off the cuff, asked this guy if he'd be willing to be his guide on a hunt. He wanted to go hunting for goats, which is something that everybody did on the Marquesas Island, and Stefan really wanted to be a part of that. And Arihano says, "Sure, I'll be your guide." Heike was a little bit caught off guard, but wasn't surprised because Stefan had been talking endlessly about how he wanted to go on a goat hunt before they left the Marquesas Island range. But she didn't feel like doing this, so she said, "You two go, I'll meet you over at the boat." So Heike turns around and starts walking down the jungle path back towards their boat, and she turns around one more time and she sees Stefan and Arihano walking into the jungle down another path, and they disappear. Heike spent the next several hours just laying out on the beach, waiting for Stefan to return, But after quite a while, and she hadn't heard anything, she started to get a little bit worried. And
Right.
as she's starting to get worried, she hears someone yelling out on the water. And from around the corner, Arihano comes around on his boat, and he's waving to her, and he's yelling for her in French that there's been an accident, that Stefan's been hurt, and she needs to come with him. Without another thought, Heiko runs into the water, jumps into Arihano's dinghy, and the two of them drive back around the corner to wherever Arihano and Stefan had been. They land at this little tiny beach that's right up against a jungle, and immediately Heike jumps out, runs right into the jungle, and she's yelling for Stefan, and there's no sign of him. He's not yelling back. She has no idea where to look, and she kept turning around and asking Arihano, where is he? What happened to him? And Arihano just wasn't really giving her a good answer. He was just being quiet. Frustrated, Heike walks even farther into the jungle. She's yelling even louder, and still there's nothing. And so she turns around to confront Arihano and be like, where is Stefan? What's going on? And as soon as she does, she's met with a gun right in her face. Heike immediately grabbed the barrel and tried to fight it away from him, and she could tell that he tried to fire the gun, but the safety was on, and so nothing fired. They kind of struggled with the gun, and at some point he got on top of her and just restrained her and tied her up to a tree. And then he just walked away into the jungle without saying anything. And so Heike is expecting at any moment for him to return and kill her. And she even said that she wished he had just shot her then and there, because the anxiety of waiting for whatever was going to happen was way worse. While Arihano was gone, Heike struggled to try to get the ropes off of her and the rope around her neck
I'm
off
stressing,
her, but she
bro.
couldn't do it. And as she's sitting there struggling, Arihano would return and he would beat her up a little bit before ultimately turning around and leaving once again. Arihano would come back a couple hours later after it had gotten dark, and she's still there struggling to get these ropes off of her, and he would hit her a couple times before leaving again. But when he hit her, he actually managed to loosen some of her restraints, and as soon as he did walk off into the jungle that second time, she was able to get the restraints off of her wrist and her neck. Now, she had no idea where Arihano was, but as soon as she took one step, she saw a flashlight maybe a couple hundred meters away flip towards her, and she knew it was Arihano. He had heard her move. And so Heike just starts running full speed. She's stepping on thorns. She's getting slashed by all the undergrowth. She doesn't care. She is running for her life.
Save
Because
yourself,
it was
bro.
a full moon, she could actually see the water because the beach was right next to where she was being held. And so she just ran for the water. And when she got onto the beach, she could see there was another boat out in the water near where theirs had been anchored. And when she looks at the beach, she can see that Arihano must have turned around because she can see a flashlight kind of bobbing its way farther and farther deeper into the jungle. Using the couple's satellite phone, Heike was able to alert authorities, who launched a search for Stefan, and initially they couldn't find him and they couldn't find Arihano. But 3 days into the search, they made a grisly discovery. The Marquesan Islands are actually known for the Marquesan warriors that used to inhabit these islands up until the 12th century, and they were
Okay.
known for being the most aggressive cannibals in the South Pacific. In particular, the island of Nuku Hiba, which is where Stefan had just gone missing, and where Heike had just been attacked by Arihano. But historians believe nobody on Marquesas has practiced cannibalism since the 12th century. That practice has gone away. Well, until 2011, when Arihano, who was in fact a Marquesas warrior, met Stefan and decided that now is a good time to bring that practice back. Right after Heike had turned around and walked back to the beach and Stefan and Arihano had gone on their hunt, Arihano had attacked Stefan, tied him up, and described seeing his neck pulsing with fear as Arihano built this massive campfire that authorities said was 3 times bigger than any campfire they'd ever come across. And then Arihano shot him and put him in the fire. Although Arihano would be captured and convicted of killing Stefan,
Wow.
Arihano would never actually come out and say that he had in fact eaten portions of Stefan, and it was impossible to tell from his remains how much had been consumed versus burned off in the fire. But virtually anybody who was involved in this case has their suspicions that Arihano had ritualistically cannibalized Stefan.
Fuck yeah, he did. Yeah, hungry hippo, bruh. What the
In the
fuck?
early morning hours of February 6th, 2014, a van carrying 5 men finally came to a stop outside of a farm in Norway. After a miserable, nearly 15-hour drive, these 5 men who were from Finland were finally ready to begin their real adventure. They were going to be attempting one of the most dangerous underwater dives in the world. It is called the Traverse, and it is a 2-kilometer subsurface dive from one entrance of the Plura cave to the other. The entrance they were going to start in was inside of the frozen pond next to this farm. 2 of the 5 men had actually done this so-called traverse before because they were the ones that discovered these 2 entrances were actually connected. But no amount of experience was going to limit the amount of physical risk they would have to take in order to complete this dive. The dive was so long, over 2 kilometers, that
this kind of stuff is stressful on me. Oh, I don't know what it is about water. Okay, I am not scared of water. I'm scared of going under the water. I'm scared of the deep down, you do deep dark. No. Deep dark bullshit. Nope, that's scary. You're floating. You're floating in darkness, and you don't know which way's up, which way's down, because you're just there. I don't like it. I don't like none of it.
You actually needed a specialized underwater scooter that could propel you through the tunnel because you wouldn't be able to swim fast enough before you ran out of air. Which also meant if your scooter broke down in the middle of this pitch black underwater cave, you were screwed. The majority of the dive was going to be through this really tight tunnel where all along the ground were these limestone rocks that kind of poked up, where if you weren't careful, if you dragged your dry suit along them, you could tear it open. And then freezing water would go into your dry suit and you would die. Also, they were going to be using a diving rig known as a rebreather. So as a Navy SEAL, we used rebreathers. Basically, it takes your air and rebreathes it. So you're not breathing air into the water, you're breathing out into the system that scrubs your CO2 and then pumps it back into you. And you also combine that rebreathed air with pure oxygen, so you have a continuous cycle where you're just breathing pure oxygen. It makes for a really cool dive because you're looking around and there's no bubbles, but it's also very dangerous, and your body doesn't really adjust well to having pure oxygen pumped into it. In fact, you can be poisoned from pure oxygen, and when you're diving at depth with a rebreather, on the way up, you can't just rocket to the surface. There are these things called decompression stops along the way up, where depending on how long you were at a certain depth, you need to wait at certain stops along the way back up to the surface and let your body decompress.
So you don't get the
do that
bends.
and you just rush to the surface, you can get something called the bends, which is decompression sickness, and it can be fatal. Not to mention, there's a couple other nasty side effects of using a rebreather, like if you get water inside of your breathing loop, it can actually get into the CO2 absorbent that sits inside of your rig, and that can cause this acidic mixture to go back into your mouth. But you can't take the mouthpiece out because more water will get into it and it'll flood your rig and then you'll just drown. So you need to just accept that there could be acid in your mouth, and you need to either get somebody else to give you their mouthpiece or get a standby rig and breathe off of that, because there's no solution to this. You just got to have acid in your mouth. Also, if you panic for any reason on a rebreather, you'll be breathing really heavy and your system will not be able to scrub the CO2 fast enough, and you'll have a buildup of CO2 in your body and you'll get hypercapnia, which can lead to disorientation and even passing out, which can be lethal underwater. This dive was famously dangerous to the point where the best divers in the world wouldn't attempt it. They called it a death wish. But these 5 divers from Finland were determined, and they were eager to make the dive.
Hold my beer, I got this.
They arrive, they take a quick nap, and then they get up and they're ready to start the dive.
They're
they decided to break up into 2 groups. They had a pair that was going to go down first, and then 2 hours later, the other 3 would follow. Once the first pair was in the water, there would be no way to communicate between the 2 groups. So the pair cuts a triangle into the ice with a chainsaw, they hop into the beautifully clear water, and very quickly they start descending down into this tunnel. Once they got down to the tunnel, they turned on their scooters and started heading out. After a couple of hours, the pair reached the most dangerous part of the dive, where the tunnel basically nosedives and goes straight down to about 130 meters. And as you're going down, you have to be very cautious that you're going the right way, because there's all these dead end tunnels that look exactly like the way you're supposed to go, and they go pretty far out. But if you were to accidentally take a wrong turn and go down one of these dead man turns, you wouldn't have enough oxygen to complete the dive. So it's a slow process of making sure you go down the exact right path. And then when you get to the bottom at 130 meters, there was this plate that had been left there to signify you've gone the right way. And then you turn and go right back up again, and you're pretty much at the exit at that point. But it takes quite a while to cover that last little bit because there are necessary decompression stops along the way. The first group descended with no issues and didn't get sidetracked. They got to the bottom where that plate was. They turned and began going back up the ascent to their first decompression stop. The lead diver got through a particularly tight spot and then noticed that his partner behind him, his flashlight, which was normally right up against him, he couldn't see it anymore. And he turned and he saw that his partner had gotten wedged in this one section of the ascent. So the lead diver turns around and swims down to the trapped diver, who he can tell is panicking a little bit because he's trying to get himself free and he can't move. And the lead diver looks and he can tell that he is thoroughly wedged into this one little section. And the lead diver would say that what he thought happened is the trap diver must have been going too quickly with his scooter and basically motorized himself into this wedge. Like it wouldn't have been humanly possible to swim fast or hard enough to get stuck as badly as he did. The lead diver could tell that he was totally stuck. There was probably no way he was going to get out of this. And so he tried taking some of his gear off, but they have such little space to work with. And the trap diver is starting to sense that this isn't going very well. And in a panic, he accidentally knocks his mouthpiece out of his mouth and can't find it again and ends up inhaling a bunch of water and he dies. The lead diver knows that he can't panic because he will end up burning through his oxygen. He'll probably get hypercapnia. He won't be able to get to the surface and he'll die too. So he tries to free his friend's body and he can't. And he's now realizing that the second set of divers that are coming in the tunnel, they're going to get to this point in the dive, which is very far into the dive, and they won't be able to get past his dead body. And they'll have to turn around, but they don't have enough oxygen, he didn't think, to make it back to the surface. And so almost certainly those three divers are going to get here and
getting itchy
and are going to die too.
I'm getting itchy.
And so
I don't like this.
And devastated and saddened by what's ultimately going to happen, he turns and starts heading for the surface. And he had to stop at each of those decompression stops. And you can only imagine what it was like to be sitting inside of this tight tunnel waiting for 30 minutes and 45 minutes at the different decompression stops, just thinking about what's inevitably going to happen beyond the dead body. They're going to get trapped. They're going to die. He's going to be the only one that gets out of here alive. And at some point he makes it up to the surface and he just sits there and waits. Meanwhile, the second set of divers did enter the water 2 hours later. They go down to the tunnel, they're making their way out, and they were farther spread out than the pair was. And so the first diver, the lead diver of the second group, he reached the dead body first before the other two had even seen it or knew about it, and he began to panic. And as the second and third diver come up and realize what's happening, they see the lead diver lose his mouthpiece, and in a panic, he's moving around like this, and he inhales water and also drowns. And so now the second and third diver are dealing with the fact that they just watched their friend die right in front of them. Their other friend from the first group is dead and blocking their way. And the second and third diver, they also begin to panic. They don't communicate, and one of them just immediately turns and starts kicking it out back towards the entrance, knowing full well they probably don't have enough oxygen to get there. The other diver decided they were going to find a way to get past the dead body that was wedged in the only way up to the surface. And so on their own, over a kilometer underwater in this tight little tunnel where they're totally trapped, there were
I need a second, MrBallen. You're too fucking good of a storyteller. I am panicking on the inside. I just need a minute. Okay. I am stressed the fuck out. Like, I don't know. I feel very claustrophobic. I feel very drowny. And I'm not liking it. All right. I'm panicking. I am panicking hard.
Lying on a flashlight for light, there's two dead bodies. This second diver begins removing pieces of their gear and pushing it through the little space between the dead body and the clearing that he wanted to get to make his way up to the surface. And after pushing through all of his gear, including his tank, which is a big commitment, because once it was through, he would have to go to the other side. He couldn't get it back through. And push himself through painstakingly with his hands all the way through this tiny little space that he could just barely get through. And then he puts his gear back on, and then knowing he had almost no oxygen left, he had to basically rocket to the surface and just hope decompression sickness didn't kill him. The other diver who had turned around and gone all the way back to the entrance, they skipped all of their decompression stops as well. They got to the entrance just barely, but when they got there, the entrance was frozen over and they had to punch their way through the ice, which they were able to do, and they too got on surface once again. The 3 survivors linked up, they called authorities, they went to the hospital, they would make a full recovery. They told authorities where their friends were in this cave, but no one had the ability to get down and retrieve their body. So they sealed off both entrances to this cave and called it a gravesite and said no one can go down there. But months later, the 3 survivors had such intense survivor's guilt that they would actually illegally go back to Plura Cave and retrieve their bodies.
It's a miracle they didn't die in the process.
In the 1930s, notorious dictator Joseph Stalin began deporting people that he viewed as threats to the regime. Now, at first, that was just political opponents, and he rounded up thousands of those. But over time, Stalin just started rounding up anybody he didn't like. And so as more and more people were deported, Stalin needed a place to put them. The option he settled on was sending these people to Siberia, because it was thousands of miles away from civilization, and the way he saw it is they wouldn't be a threat to the regime anymore because they'd be too busy just trying to survive. Eventually, millions of people were deported to Siberia to fend for themselves, and many people died in the process. But the worst fate of anybody deported to Siberia has to be the roughly 7,000 people that were sent to Nazino Island off the western side of Siberia. In May of 1933, the first 5,000 deportees that would be sent to Nazino Island arrived on its shores. Now, they had been packed inside of barges. Many of them were weak or sick, and so disease quickly spread. And just by the time they arrived, 27 people had already died just in transit.
That's
As
awful.
the survivors disembark onto this snowy island, they see immediately that there's nothing on it. It's this tiny little island. There's no shelter. There's no food. There's no tools. There's no way to make shelter. They're just totally stranded. Their Soviet guards had promised them a ration of flour, but for the first 4 days, they refused to give it to them, and another 295 people died. And to make matters worse, after a couple of days, another almost 2,000 people were shipped out to this island. And so by the time the guards actually took their boats into shore to give the flour to these people, they were starving to death, and they rushed the boats to try to steal the flour, and the guards began shooting at them, took the flour, and went back out to the water. The next day, they came back in to try to give them the flour, and the same thing happened. And so they went back out to the water, and they orchestrated this plan where for every 150 prisoners, there would be a brigadier. And that brigadier would be in charge of coming out and getting the flour and then bringing it back to those 150. But the brigadiers were all criminals, and they would come out, take the flour, and then not distribute it. And so no one got any flour, so no one could eat anything. And the people who did get flour rations mixed it with water, and then they would eat that raw, and it gave them dysentery, and then they died. Totally desperate, these deportees began constructing these crude rafts and began trying to cross the river to the other side, but many of them broke apart and they would drown in the freezing waters. And if they didn't drown, the guards would see them crossing and would take shots at them. And so if they didn't drown or get shot and they did make it to the other side, they'd be in the Siberian wasteland with no supplies, and they would die there too. And so Nazino Island completely devolved into chaos. Almost immediately, cannibalism became a thing, and there were these roving gangs of people that were the strongest and fittest of the island who would just go around and murder the weak and eat them. And the guards that were watching this did nothing to stop it, and frankly couldn't if they wanted to, because you've now reached the absolute extremes of human survival. One local woman who would make an annual trip to Nazino Island before there were people being deported there made her annual trip and was shocked to see all these people on this island that normally had no one there. And she said from her boat, she watched this group of people run up on this woman, drag her to a tree, they tied her to the tree, and then began cutting off pieces of her while she was alive and eating it right in front of her. And then after the group had left, the woman who was tied to the tree was still alive, and what looked like her partner, her boyfriend, her husband comes over, tries to untie her, he tries to save her, but there's nothing he can do, and she dies in his arms. Another local who managed to save a woman from Nazino Island, she got her into her house and she sat her down, and she noticed that the backs of her legs were all bandaged up. And she asked her what was going on with the backs of her legs, and she undid her dressing, and her calf muscles on her legs were gone. Someone had cut them off and eaten them. Of the nearly 7,000 people that were sent to Nazino Island, only 2,000 remained at the end of the first month they were there. And in fact, when word got out to Stalin that this island had become Cannibal Island, he actually shut it down and moved the remaining 2,000 deportees to another labor camp where unfortunately many of them died as well. And sadly, those few thousand people only represent a fraction of the massive number of people that died during Stalin's many purges. So that's going to do it, guys. I hope you enjoyed today's stories. Let me know in the comments what you
I did, MrBallen. Thank you so much for having me. That was a traumatizing time, especially the underwater part. I don't do well with the underwaters. Mister, can we stays on the land for a while, please? All right, I really enjoyed today's video. If y'all enjoyed today's video, please go down there, leave a thumbs up. While you're down there, if you want, go on over and slap that subscribe button, become part of the B5 Nation. We do some crazy stuff here, bro. If you want to know when that crazy stuff happens, ding that bell. Turn on all notifications. That way you know when this beautiful mug is back on that screen. As always, be good to one another. I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye. Why does everybody just want to eat people? Video, the one video, motherfucker got 8. Last video, motherfucker got 8. I'm pretty sure the second video, the water one, I'm sure they was getting eaten by fishes, but at least it wasn't people's. What's... Yeah.